The room went silent the moment he walked in, not because anyone told it to, because something old and dangerous passed through the doorway with him. Power, not the kind you see in bank accounts or boardrooms, the kind that marches, salutes orders, and is obeyed. He didn't wear a uniform anymore, not here, not today, but you could still see it in the way he moved, the way others moved around him, back straight, chin lifted, eyes scanning everything as if he were assessing a battlefield. Like there were no walls he hadn't walked through, no room he hadn't already dominated by the time the door closed behind him. His name was General Marcus Harlow. 3 stars retired, decades of service, decorations that meant something to people who knew what they cost. Whole careers had been built under his command, whole regions reshaped by his signature. His file, if laid flat, would cover the entire defense table. Today, it was reduced to one word on a white sheet of paper: defendant. And above that word, in block letters, another name quietly ruled the room: Judge Joseph Wapner. Harlow's presence hit the courtroom like a weather front. The air shifted. Temperatures didn't change. Pressure did. Even without his dress uniform, the military bled through his civilian suit. He was in his mid-60s, tall, broad-shouldered, neck thick with old muscle that hadn't completely melted into age. His hair, once jet black, was now iron gray, cut short and neat. His face was a map of sun and years. Deep lines cut through the skin around his mouth and eyes, set there by strain, squinting, shouting, and sometimes laughter shared in dangerous places. But his eyes, cold, hard, sharp as broken glass, the kind of eyes that had watched satellite feeds and casualty reports without flinching. The suit he wore was dark, perfectly fitted. His tie was muted, not flashy, not humble, calculated. He carried himself with the expectation that space would be made for him. And it was, even here, even now. As he moved to the defendant's chair, one of his former aides, now an assistant in a crisp civilian jacket, hovered a half-step behind, as if still waiting for orders. The front row of the gallery was a strange mix. A few men in old uniforms, ribbons faded but neatly pinned. Some families, dressed stiffly for court. A woman in a simple blouse, her posture rigid, fingers white where they clutched a folded photograph. The media were here too, not just local, national, some international. They knew what this was, not just a trial, a clash between two kinds of authority, the one that carried guns and the one that carried laws. The cameras found Harlow's profile. They lived there, on old news reels, press conferences, success stories. They'd never seen it from this angle before. Lower, below the bench. Under judgment. He sat down without being told, not rudely, just with the certainty of someone who'd been sitting at the head of tables his whole life. He didn't look at the judge first. He looked at the seal on the wall behind him, read the Latin, slow, as if measuring whether the words still applied to him. Then finally his gaze slid downward, to the man in black robes, to the only person in this building who didn't move around him, Judge Joseph Wapner. Their eyes met, only for a heartbeat. But in that instant the room felt the collision. Rank versus robe, steel versus wood, a life of command versus a lifetime of judgment. No one spoke. Then the bailiff's voice shattered the spell. All rise. Everyone stood. Harlow stood too, not quickly, not reluctantly, just deliberately, like he was permitting his own compliance. The difference was small, but everyone saw it, especially the judge. He always did. The charges read out were clinical, words that hid messy truths underneath. Abuse of authority, unlawful retaliation, obstruction. On their own, they sounded narrow, technical, but the story inside them burned. Years ago, when he'd still worn his stars on his shoulders, General Harlow had commanded a regional operations group overseeing drone strikes, intelligence operations, and counterinsurgency campaigns. He had been the man whose orders flowed down through a web of officers to men and women at screens and on the ground. He'd been lauded, praised, called uncompromising and decisive by commentators who'd never smelled cordite. He slept fine, or at least well enough. Then, as with so many stories in rooms like this, one person refused to go along. Captain Elena Ruiz, military lawyer, JAG Corps. Her job was to say no when the machine wanted her to nod yes. She wasn't a soldier in the usual sense. Her battles were fought over clauses and codes, not hills and houses. But she wore the uniform too. And once she'd looked up to Harlow, at least until the day he signed an order she couldn't accept. On paper, it was an internal directive, a reclassification of certain incidents. Civilians caught in operations were to be flagged under a new category. Proximity compromise, it was called, a term that in practice made them disappear into the fog. Reports tagged that Way would be filed differently, not counted in specific civilian casualty tallies, not triggering certain mandatory reviews. To the untrained eye, nothing looked amiss. To someone like Ruiz, buried in documentation, the pattern screamed. She flagged it. She brought it up, not in public, not on camera. In a closed-door briefing, she laid the forms on the table, highlighted the shifts. She asked, "Why?" The room went quiet. Harlow, at the head of the table, barely looked up from the report he was skim-reading. "We're overcounting," he said. "We're paralyzing ourselves. The field calls it a cleanup. The politicians call it a scandal. I call it noise. This aligns our language with operational reality." She pushed, respectfully, then firmly. "Sir, this alters how civilian harm is recorded. It may violate reporting protocols. It might be unlawful." That got his attention. He set the report down, slow, looked at her, cold. The meeting ended soon after. Officially, nothing changed. Unofficially, everything did. Her assignments dried up. Her clearance was suddenly under review. She was cut out of key meetings, given busy work. Then a complaint appeared in her file. Then a review. Then an offer, take a transfer, far away, quiet, no more trouble. She didn't take it. She went higher instead, filed an internal complaint. It went nowhere, no surprise. So she did the one thing the system never expects from its own. She stepped outside it, to an inspector general. Paper moved, slow, reluctant, but it moved. By the time it reached the outer layer of public view, the uniform was off her shoulders. She resigned. He hadn't, not yet. But the question had been planted. Had a decorated general reclassified civilian casualties to protect his own record? And in doing so, had he broken the law, the military would handle its own. They said that at first. Boards, panels, inquiries. But somewhere along the chain, the thing everyone pretends doesn't exist happened. Conflict of interest. Too many hands with too many stars touched too many papers. Someone outside had to step in. A civilian court, not to try him for war crimes, not to relitigate foreign policy. Those things live in other, shadowed rooms. This one had a single, narrow focus. Did Marcus Harlow misuse his authority to punish someone who tried to do the right thing? And did he obstruct legal reporting requirements in the process? To him, that question was an insult. To everyone watching, it was something else. A test. Could rank be told no? Here, under these lights, under this name on the bench, we were all going to find out. From the first moment Ruiz spoke, Harlow's contempt filled the room. She sat straight in the witness box, her hair pulled back, her civilian clothes plain. No ribbons, no metal, just posture and scars you couldn't see. Her voice was steady, too steady. The kind that's been practiced in empty rooms. She described the directive, the emails, the meetings, the fallout. As she did, Harlow shifted in his chair. Not much, enough. He turned slightly away from her, crossed his arms over his chest, exhaled loudly at one particularly detailed explanation, like the air itself bored him. A juror in the front row, an older man with oil stains still shadowing his hands from work, glanced at him with a frown. The prosecutor noticed. The cameras noticed. Most of all, Joseph Wapner noticed. When Ruiz described the reclassification, one of Harlow's old staff officers, seated behind him, stared at the table, jaw tight. He knew, they all did, how the labels worked. How a single change in wording could shift what was seen and what would be handled internally. Harlow's inner circle shifted with discomfort. He didn't. His gaze stayed flat, unmoved. When she got to the retaliation, the meeting she'd suddenly not been invited to, the sarcastic remarks in front of peers, the performance review that described her as overly rigid on legal interpretation, Harlow let out a low snort, almost a laugh. He shook his head, muttered something under his breath. Those close enough to hear caught one word: ridiculous. Ruiz's hands tightened briefly on the edge of the stand. Her knuckles went white. She kept her eyes forward. She spent too long in rooms like that to let his derision knock her aim. But the jury, they weren't used to this. They weren't used to men with chests full of invisible ribbons showing open, casual disrespect to a woman who'd done nothing but answer the questions put to her. It registered. You could see it. One of the jurors, a woman with teacher's eyes, shifted, leaning subtly away from Harlow's direction, as if something in that corner of the room had grown cold, toxic. When it was Harlow's turn, the tone of the entire proceeding shifted. He took the stand like he'd taken stages, slow, measured. He didn't look at Ruiz as he passed. He didn't need to. In his mind, she was already a footnote. He swore the oath without hesitation. The words sounded strange on his tongue, not because they were new, because this time he wasn't the one demanding them from others. He sat down, posture immaculate, hands folded in front of him. His attorney began the story he liked: childhood, enlistment, rise through the ranks. He talked about deployments. He didn't describe them in detail. He didn't need to. The ribbons had already done the talking. He let just enough humility slip to sound human. A soldier like any other. But the way he said it told another truth. He stopped being any other a long time ago. They moved to the directive. He called it a linguistic adjustment, a way to harmonize internal reporting. He used words like efficiency, clarity, operational cohesion. He spoke of Ruiz with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. Dedicated, he called her, principled, sometimes to the point of inflexibility. He described her objections as interpretive disagreements. He insisted no one had been punished. Transfers, demotions, reassignments, these were standard career movements in a dynamic environment. He made everything sound mundane, bureaucratic, safe. If you'd only heard him, if you'd only read his statements on a page, you might have believed it. But people weren't just listening. They were watching. They were watching the slight curl at the corner of his mouth when he mentioned her idealism. The hint of disdain in his voice when he said, "It's not my job to educate junior officers about the complexities of policy." They were watching the way his eyes flicked toward the gallery when he said, "civilians," as if the word tasted off. And they were watching how, when he finished each neat, minimized answer, his shoulders relaxed just a fraction. The way a man's do when he thinks he's put some troublesome thing back in its box. Joseph Wapner watched too, and he was not a man easily put in a box. Cross-examination was not friendly. It wasn't meant to be. The prosecutor didn't try to match Harlow's bearing. He didn't try to outrank him. He could not. That wasn't his weapon. His weapon was smaller, sharper, paper. "General," he said, laying a printed email on the screen, "this is a message you sent to your senior staff shortly after Captain Ruiz raised her concerns. It appeared under the overhead lights. Plain, undeniable. We do not have the luxury of over-lawyering every operational nuance," the prosecutor read. "Our role is to win fights, not to provide talking points for committees. Identify personnel who are misaligned with the mission and reassign as necessary." He looked at Harlow. "Did you write this?" The general's jaw ticked. "Yes," he said. "In response to a pattern, did you consider Captain Ruiz misaligned with the mission?" The prosecutor pressed. "I considered her approach incompatible with the realities of, did you order her removed from key assignments?" Harlow's nostrils flared. "I approved personnel adjustments made by her direct superior." "So yes?" the prosecutor asked. Harlow's eyes narrowed. "Yes," he said, "as I was within my rights to do." The jury watched. They didn't understand all the acronyms. They didn't know the specific branches of the chain of command. They knew this. A man with power had seen a woman raising her hand and had decided the hand needed to be removed, not the thing it was pointing at. The prosecutor continued. He pulled up a draft version of the directive on civilian reporting. Highlighted sections showed how phrases like civilian collateral had been replaced with proximate non-combatant presence. How civilian injury had become environmental factor impact. He read them aloud. The words sounded even more obscene when spoken. "General," he asked, "why did you choose to alter these terms?" Harlow's lips thinned. "We were aligning with updated nomenclature," he said. "Language evolves. Our terminology needed to reflect." "Reflect what?" the prosecutor asked. "Less responsibility." A murmur trembled through the gallery. Harlow's eyes flashed. "That's an insult," he said sharply. "No, General," the prosecutor replied, voice suddenly hard. "What's an insult is calling a dead child an environmental factor impact so that you don't have to put a mark in the civilian casualty column." The room froze. Even the air held still for a moment. Judge Wapner's eyes narrowed. He didn't rebuke the prosecutor, not yet, because the line, however fierce, was not untrue, and truth still held weight here. The questioning dug deeper. The prosecutor brought out logs showing how, after the directive took effect, the official civilian casualty count in one sector dropped by nearly 40%, while independent observers, reports indicated no such decrease. Showed internal memos from staffers tentatively asking if they were under-reporting incidents. He showed replies from Harlow's office saying, "Follow current classification scheme." No deviations. Each piece was a small cut, on its own survivable. Together they turned his linguistic adjustment into what it really was, a shield, not over his men, over his record. When the prosecutor finally sat down, the balance in the room had shifted. Not fully, not officially, not yet, but visibly. The jury's eyes no longer held the same reflexive deference. The veterans in the front row still sat straight, but some of them stared at Harlow now with something like hurt. The woman with the photograph in her hands held it tighter. The photos inside were of a young man in uniform, smiling. His name had never been tied to this case. Neither had the operation that took him. But the sight of a general twisting words to avoid counting the dead hit something raw in her anyway. Because she knew what it meant to count, and to not count, to be recorded, or to be renamed. Then came the moment no one saw coming, the instant humiliation, the thing that would be clipped, uploaded, shared, and replayed under titles like General Gets Destroyed in Court and Wapner Teaches a General a Lesson in 30 Seconds. It was small, quick, explosive. It happened when the judge asked a question, when he had every right to ask. One that in any other context would have been ordinary. General Harlow, he said calmly, before we proceed to sentencing, is there anything you wish to say directly regarding your treatment of Captain Ruiz? It was an opening, small, simple, a chance, not to erase, but to adjust, to show something like acknowledgement, remorse, even if fractioned. Harlow misread it. Badly. He straightened, squared his shoulders. The old reflex, treat questions like challenges, beat them down. His voice dropped into that command tone that had sent young officers scrambling for decades. With respect, Your Honor, he said, I do not accept the premise of this entire proceeding. Operational command decisions being second-guessed in a civilian court, it's outrageous. People who have never held a rifle judging people who have spent their lives ensuring they have the freedom not to. He flicked a glance at the jury, then at Ruiz, then back at the judge. I followed the mission, he continued. I enforced discipline. If some people were too fragile for that environment and ran to outside authorities, that doesn't make me a criminal, it makes them weak. There it was, spoken aloud, the thing that had been humming beneath his every expression, his every shrug, his every laugh, weaker, lower, beneath me. The words hit the room like a detonation. Ruiz flinched, not because she was surprised. Because hearing it in that room, in that context, stripped of all pretense, was like being shoved all over again. One of the jurors, the teacher, drew in a sharp breath. Her eyes flashed. The mechanic's jaw clenched. In the gallery, someone muttered, unbelievable, under their breath. A veteran in the front row, his own shoulders heavy with his years of service, shook his head slowly, not against civilian courts, against the man on the stand. Judge Wapner's face did not change much, but his eyes, they hardened. He looked at Harlow for a long, precise second. Then very clearly he spoke. Sit down, General. Not please, not if you would. Just sit. The word did something. Harlow hesitated. His body, used to that single syllable from his own mouth, balked at hearing it from someone else, especially someone not in uniform. Then, slowly, he sat. Not because he wanted to, because he had no choice, because rank doesn't exist here. Because in this room, that two-word order didn't come from him. It came for him, and everyone felt it. The dynamic in that instant flipped. So fast the room took a second to catch up. Judge Wapner didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the gavel. He didn't need to. The power in the room had all drained to his end of the bench. This, he said, gesturing lightly in Harlow's direction, is exactly the arrogance we have seen throughout these proceedings. His tone was controlled. Each syllable laid down like a brick. You have repeatedly rolled your eyes at testimony. You have openly scoffed at suggestions that your choices, your orders, should be examined. And now, after a jury has carefully weighed evidence and found you liable for retaliation and obstruction, you look at this court and call it outrageous that you are being judged at all. He shook his head. Slow, deliberate. Let me disabuse you of something, General, he said. You are not being judged for winning or losing wars. You are not on trial for your medals or your missed sleep. He leaned forward slightly. We are not here, he continued, to second-guess every battlefield decision you ever made. Here because in a quiet office far from gunfire, he tapped the papers in front of him. You signed a directive that hid civilian casualties behind sterile language, and you punished the one person in your command who tried to bring that to light. He paused. Cowards, he added, Do that from behind desks, not from trenches. The word hung there, cowards. He hadn't said Harlow was one, not directly. He described an action. Let everyone else draw the line. Harlow's eyes flashed. His throat moved. For once he said nothing, because any word now would only fall into the silence like a confession. You talk about rifles, Wapner went on, and freedom, and who has the right to judge. The answer, General, is simple. He gestured around the room. To them, he said. To the citizens whose name is on your paycheck, whose sons and daughters wear the uniforms you command, whose laws you swore to uphold along with their safety. He looked at the jury. Today, he said, they judged, and you do not get to call them weak for doing so. The teacher on the jury blinked hard, fighting tears that surprised even her. The mechanic's fists unclenched. Even one of the veterans in the front row, an old man with a faded unit patch on his blazer, nodded once, slow, eyes bright. For them, this wasn't disrespect to the military. It was the opposite. It was drawing a line between the institution and the man who thought he stood above it. Sentencing in this case was a complex beast. The court was limited. This wasn't a war crimes tribunal. This wasn't a military court-martial. This was a civilian court addressing specific violations, retaliation against a whistleblower and obstruction of mandated reporting. There were no prison terms measured in decades on the table, but there were still teeth, sharp, real, deadly to the thing Harlow valued most, authority. I have considered the seriousness of your conduct, Wapner said. I have considered the chilling effect it has on others who may see things that must be reported. I have considered the unique position of trust you held. He folded his hands. I have also, he added, considered your behavior here, your contempt, your refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, your insistence even now that you are the victim of some outrage rather than the author of your own circumstances. He took a breath. The law allows for fines, he said. It allows for injunctive relief. It allows, in cases like this, for the restriction of certain future privileges. He looked at him. General Harlow, he said, you are hereby ordered to compensate Captain Ruiz fully for the damage you have caused to her career and livelihood, lost wages, lost advancement, emotional distress. He named a figure, substantial, enough to be felt even by a man with a general's pension. Harlow's jaw clenched. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the acknowledgement, in ink, that she'd been wronged and he'd done the wrong. You are also, the judge went on, permanently barred from holding any advisory or contractual position with the Department of Defense, its contractors, or any government agency in any capacity related to operational oversight, whistleblower policy, or casualty reporting. That, more than anything, hit him. It hit him like a physical blow. You could see it, the slight sway. The way his hand gripped the arm of the chair more tightly, because that was his future. The lobbyist circuits, the fat contracts, the consulting roles where he'd sit in comfortable chairs and tell younger officers how to do what he'd done, only more quietly. Gone, cancelled, because of one woman he'd thought he'd shoved out of the way. He opened his mouth. Stopped. The message, Wapner said, voice steady, must be clear. If you use your power to bury the voices of those trying to keep you within the law, you will lose the privilege of using that power again. He looked at him, really looked. In your world, he said, instant punishment often came from your orders, Article 15s, demotions, reassignments. Today you receive a taste of instant consequence yourself. The phrase carried a charge. Instant consequence. Harlow swallowed. The cameras zoomed. This was the moment the thumbnails would be built around. His face, stunned, stripped, smaller than his rank. The court will also, Wapner added, refer this matter and its findings to the appropriate military authorities with a strong recommendation that your actions be reviewed for potential further discipline within your former chain of command. He paused. In other words, he said, this is not the end of scrutiny for you. It is the beginning. The gallery reacted in waves. Shock. Then that strange, almost fragile thing, satisfaction, not joy. No one walked out of there happy. Too much ruin lay behind the facts for that. But there was a sense, a rare, heavy sense, that something had landed where it needed to. Ruiz closed her eyes. Her shoulders shuddered once. When she opened them again, her gaze drifted to the bench. Their eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just held her gaze for a moment, steady, respectful. It was enough. For the first time since she'd filed that internal report and watched the walls close in, she felt vindicated, not safe. That was gone, but heard, counted, not an over-ethical element. A citizen, protected, finally, by the system she tried to protect from the inside. In the front row, the veteran with the faded patch put a hand over his heart, not out of patriotism, out of grief and relief colliding. This, he whispered to the woman next to him, is what we were supposed to be fighting for. She nodded, tears on her cheeks, not for flags, for lines. Lines between power and abuse, between service and self, between language and lies. Harlow remained seated, shock rooting him. He had expected debate, appeals to respect his service. Maybe even a reprimand wrapped in compliments. He had not expected this. Instant stripping of future influence. Public recognition that he'd retaliated. Official language that would haunt any biography, any article, any future introduction. Found liable for obstructing reporting and retaliating against a whistleblower. He looked smaller now, not physically, existentially, like his presence no longer bent the air around him. The bailiff moved. Everyone watched. This wasn't a criminal sentence with prison attached. No handcuffs would be placed on his wrists. Not today, not in this court. But the way the bailiff approached, the formality of it, still hit him. General Harlow is remanded to the custody of the marshals pending the completion of the civil orders, the clerk announced. He would be escorted, not freely walking out to flashbulbs and microphones. Escorted, controlled, directed. For a man whose every step for decades had been voluntarily saluted, the change was sharp. He rose slowly. For the first time that day, his age showed, not in his body, in his eyes. He turned slightly, scanning the room, not for allies, for sympathy. He found little. The veterans looked away, not in rejection, in refusal to offer the absolution he wanted. Ruiz didn't look at him again. Her victory wasn't in his eyes. It was in the record, the paper, the tape. The teacher on the jury watched him with a stern, unyielding gaze, as if he were a student who'd finally been sent to the office after terrorizing the class all year. The mechanic exhaled. Low, long, something hard in him softening, a belief that had been rusted over by years of seeing the rich and powerful skate had been scrubbed just a little. They can be touched, sometimes, not always, but sometimes. As Harlow stepped toward the side door, the cameras tracked him. They framed his back. His stiff shoulders, the faint tremor in his left hand, the contrast between how he'd entered and how he was leaving was stark. No music swelled, no narrator spoke, just the sound of shoes on cheap courtroom carpet and the quiet buzz of whispered reactions. He really called her weak, someone breathed near the back, and Wapner just shut him down. Good. About time. The door closed behind him with a soft, hollow thud. His image vanished. But the imprint he'd left, the arrogance, the contempt, the belief that stars on his shoulders meant immunity from civilian law, remained in the room like smoke. And against that, the other imprint pressed back, a judge who had not flinched, who had not gushed about service as a shield against scrutiny, who had said, in effect, "Thank you for what you did right. Now answer for what you did wrong." That complexity rarely makes it into speeches. Today, it made it into the record. The video that went viral didn't try to explain the entire directive system. It didn't dive into every clause, every code. It focused on one sequence, one short, devastating exchange. Harlow saying, people who have never held a rifle judging people who have spent their lives ensuring they have the freedom not to. And Wapner calm, severe. Today they judged, and you do not get to call them weak for doing so. Clipped, captioned, replayed. It moved through veteran forums. Legal blogs, political feeds, some were outraged. Civilians don't understand war. It's wrong to put generals on trial like this. Others pushed back, strong. This wasn't about war, this was about lying. He punished someone for following the law. If people like him are untouchable, then what did we serve for? Underneath the noise, one quiet current cut through. The sight of a man who'd gotten used to consequence flowing in only one direction, finally feeling even a fraction of it wash back over him. It didn't level the world. It didn't fix everything. But it changed the shape of one story. The story that says power always, always wins. For one day, in one room, under one name, that story was wrong. In that room, the last word did not belong to the man with the rank. It belonged to the man with the robe.